Indivisible is a lot of game to take in. From its huge map that requires a surprising number of exploration upgrades to traverse, to the battle system that takes active turn-based RPG combat and throws in a handful of fighting game elements, the game can honestly be a bit overwhelming at times. But with a constant deluge of new party members, Metroid-style platforming mechanics, and gorgeous artwork, Indivisible is certainly never boring, and if you manage to wrap your head around the game's systems in the early hours, you're in for a unique and satisfying experience. Part of why Indivisible is such a satisfying game to play is also one of its more difficult to grasp elements, its combat. As I mentioned, the game features a somewhat unique spin on active turn-based combat. Rather than having your characters placed into an initiative order on a per-encounter basis, your active party members have attacks and abilities that are mapped to one of the face buttons of your controller, and these require a cooldown before they can be used again. As long as you have these actions stored, you're able to have that character act whenever your enemies aren't also acting. You're also able to use an active block to minimize damage or even recover health if you time it perfectly. So far, so simple. Where Indivisible's combat really starts to get complex is in its character movesets. You can have up to 3 additional party members alongside the game's protagonist from fairly early on, and each of the game's 20 playable characters have unique movesets that include juggles, trips, buffs, debuffs, area of effect attacks, and more, and these are assigned to your chosen face button as well as combining that button with up or down inputs. Frankly, I love how differently most of the characters play from one another, and by bringing something distinct to battle, you're encouraged to change your party makeup almost constantly, which you can pretty much do at any time. My one real issue with the number of characters and their varied movesets is that Indivisible could do a better job of explaining how they work. When you unlock a character, you're presented with a brief splash screen describing some of their more unique features, but to really grasp how characters work properly, you need to take them for an extended test run at the very least. Some kind of move list would not go amiss, especially since not every character has access to moves that might be crucial for certain monsters, such as juggling attacks that break blocks. And the game also encourages stringing attacks together, both for each character individually and between all 4 party members, so knowing what your characters could do would be really helpful. To that extent, combat feels almost like a simple fighting game. To string attacks together effectively, you have to actually time your inputs well. Mashing attacks out could lead to wasted action since your moves often shift enemy positions, and given the pseudo-turn-based nature of combat, wasted actions could be disastrous. In sticking with the game's fighting game heritage, you even have access to a super meter which most characters can burn to make use of more powerful attacks, but again, the game neglects to tell you about every character who can utilize this meter. With Indivisible's more unique combat mechanics aside, there are some more traditional elements to be found as well. As mentioned earlier, you have an active block on hand to mitigate incoming damage, but you're also able to attack enemies outside of encounters to not only cause them damage, but to also go into battle with your party's attacks locked and loaded. Positioning your party also comes into play to some degree, as certain enemy attacks target your characters in a line or within a certain radius, but with that said, these positioning mechanics aren't super integral, and you're able to burn meter to have all your party members block at once, which makes AoE attacks by your enemies a little less effective. The rest of Indivisible's gameplay is much more straightforward, though seeing it implemented in an RPG is somewhat novel, for me at least. At the outset, the game's non-combat sections take the form of a fairly simple 2D platformer. You have a side dash, a slide, a jump, and a wall jump. But it's not long before Indivisible starts throwing traversal upgrades at you a la Metroid. You'll get an axe to chop down barriers and help you climb walls, a bow and arrow to shoot switches, and so on. Now, Indivisible is not a Metroidvania-style game. There is plenty of exploration to be had, but most of it is in service to optional collectible hunting more than anything. It's not super often that you'll have to go to one location to unlock a new skill before returning to pass a previously insurmountable obstacle, though that does happen on occasion. No, for the most part, the first time you find something blocking your path, one of your companions will pop up and teach you something new, or the player character, Ajna, will just teach herself the ability, because why not? What I'm trying to say is that Indivisible isn't much of a Metroidvania, but it is a fine platformer. It's not super challenging in the early stages, and it's fairly linear, beyond a couple of areas that I managed to sequence break with some crafty platforming, but with each new skill, the game's basic platforming starts to get a bit more interesting. Chaining wall jumps together with axe climbing, then stringing together air dashes and ceiling clinging techniques can feel supremely enjoyable. With that said, it's not so enjoyable that revisiting areas over and over again doesn't get somewhat tedious. This isn't a huge problem, as much of Indivisible's backtracking is purely optional and usually revolves around your party members' unique story quests. Considering how well the game's characters and their stories grabbed me, I'd say that the frustrating backtracking is a small price to pay, though it is one with a relatively easy fix. Just let players warp between save bells in the final act of the game. Done. As I mentioned, Indivisible's characters and their stories are certainly a high point for me, as they just ooze so much personality and cultural influence. Without this very distinct cultural flavour, the game's plot probably wouldn't stand out half as much as it does. It boils down to a very familiar stop the evil conqueror / god from destroying the world style plot, though it does feature some particularly sincere writing which put a smile on my face. Ajna, the protagonist in particular, is hard not to like. She's flawed in ways that I don't see too often in video game heroes recently, but she's trying so genuinely to do good that she remains likable, even when she's doing something incredibly dumb that's sure to have some far-reaching consequences. The affable quality that Ajna and her companions possess is achieved not only through the game's sincere writing, but also the voice work that brings these characters to life. For the most part, the game's characters have very authentic accents, and the dialogue is peppered with various terms from a number of different languages, which serves to fuel the game's strong sense of culture. It feels like these characters genuinely exist in this world that is so far removed from the Western-inspired settings we see in so many other games. This quality extends to the soundtrack as well, which lends an epic and occasionally ethereal tone to the heavily myth-inspired game setting. The setting itself is realized with a bright and vibrant visual style, with 3D side-scrolling environments inhabited by gorgeously hand-drawn 2D characters and monsters. I don't think I'm being hyperbolic when I say that at least half of the NPCs in this game and every single one of your companions could comfortably be the lead character in their own story. Their designs are just that interesting and enjoyable to look at. It also helps that the animations fueling these characters are smooth and full of life. Honestly, the biggest thing pushing me forward through the game wasn't the story or how much I was enjoying the combat, even though I was enjoying these elements a lot. It was my excitement with regards to seeing who would join my crew next. The setting itself is also fascinating, taking elements from various Southeast Asian cultures and beyond to create a varied and interesting world, from the neon-drenched high-rises of the Thailand-inspired Tai Krung to the heavily industrialized Iron Kingdom. It's also worth noting that the game features a handful of fully animated cutscenes which are genuinely breathtaking. Part of me wishes they were more frequent, but their scarcity makes them feel a little more special, while the animatics and simple dialogue box cutscenes that the game predominantly uses are perfectly serviceable in their absence. Finally, if you're like me and love sinking your teeth into companion missions and side quests, Indivisible has you covered, with 20 or so to tackle in the final act of the game. As I said earlier, this does lead to a lot of tedious backtracking, but if you're desperate to wring more out of this already fairly lengthy game like I was, then it's all worth it. There are also collectibles that allow you to boost your defense as well as your action slots in combat, so there is some value to backtracking beyond simply soaking in the game's cultures and the characters' stories. So with all that said, Indivisible is excellent. For me, Indivisible is more than the sum of its parts. It's a serviceable platformer with some interesting combat mechanics that merge turn-based RPG battles with fighting game elements without diving too deeply into either, and that's sure to turn some people off. But if you're interested in trying something that's gorgeous, fairly unique, and with a cultural identity that is interesting and not often seen in this medium, then I can't recommend the game highly enough.